Others. We are gathered here to discuss the draft UGC regulations 2025. As you all know, these regulations infringe upon the powers of the states in legislating higher education and thus undermines the federal foundations of our country. It is in this context that this national convention assumes significance. I am glad that we have representatives from various states here with us to join hands in this effort of protecting the basic tenets of our Constitution. Let me place on record our appreciation to the ministers from Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Telangana, and the officials from Jharkhand and Telangana who are present with us here today, representing their respective state governments. At the outset, let me extend a warm welcome to each one of you and underline the fact that the onus lies on us in attempting to redefine the role and function of the UGC vis-à-vis its regulatory power and reaffirming the role of states that establish and maintain state universities. State universities operate according to laws passed by the respective state legislatures. Under item 32 of the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution, the establishment and supervision of universities are under the jurisdiction of the states. The union government's authority is limited to coordinating and setting standards for higher education, research institutions under item 66 of the union list. It is on the basis of this that the UGC issues regulations under the UGC Act. However, in his speech responding to the debate in the Constituent Assembly on August 31st, 1949, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar had clearly defined the scope and limits of item 66 in the union list. He said that if the pass marks or criteria for degree examinations conducted by various universities in India were to differ significantly, it would cause considerable difficulty. He further stated that the inclusion of such an item in the union list was only to avoid such uncoordinated systems and to ensure uniform standards and methods across states. We need to be mindful of these words when engaging in the framing of laws and rules pertaining to higher education. Despite the words of the chairman of the drafting committee of the Indian Constitution, according to the 42nd Amendment to the Constitution that came into effect on the 3rd of January 1977, education, including higher education, was moved from the state list to the concurrent list as item 25. And now the fact that it is in the concurrent list being used to not merely diminish the role of state governments in administering higher education, but to effectively sideline them as a whole posing great challenges to our diverse systems of education prevailing in the states. The strengthening of such systems are essential for the preservation of our cultural and linguistic diversities. As soon as the draft UGC regulations 2025 became public, the anti-federal and anti-democratic content, which would have ruinous effects on the entire country's higher education sector, was evident. Therefore, the Kerala Legislative Assembly unanimously passed a resolution urging the Union government to withdraw them. We also called upon the Union government to engage in detailed discussions with all stakeholders, taking their opinion seriously before issuing new guidelines. Furthermore, we have appointed a 5-member committee under the stewardship of Professor Prabhat Patnaik to formulate our views on these new regulations and respond to the UGC. Professor Patnaik is here with us today and will be making a detailed presentations on the draft regulations. Therefore, let me not go into them at length, but just make mention at a few of the most glaring issues on it. The primary issue with the draft regulation is that they do not envisage any role for the state governments in the appointment of the vice chancellors of the public universities established under the state acts and thus impinge on the legitimate rights of the states in a federal setup. In the selection process of vice chancellors, all powers are sought to be vested in the chancellor by taking away the function of constituting the search cum selection committee from the higher education departments. If the chancellor can appoint anyone from a panel, undoubtedly the appointment will be at the behest of the political powers that have appointed the governor. As in almost all state universities, governors are chancellors. In that sense, the draft regulations are against the basic federal principles enshrined in the Constitution. It is important to share an experience we have had in Kerala with regard to the position of both governor and chancellor being by the same person. Following political interventions by the gubernatorial office in the administration of state universities, as their chancellor, the Kerala Legislative Assembly passed bills that sought to prevent such excesses. However, several bills were set upon, questioning the autonomy of the legislature. This prompted us to go to the Honorable Supreme Court. When the court took exception to such extra-constitutional methods, assent was immediately given to some of them, and the rest were sent to the President. This made it clear that the gubernatorial office was being used for political motives, especially with regard to running state universities. Another issue is that the draft regulations also pose a threat to the country's higher education sector as a whole. How? By proposing to make non-academics eligible for appointment as VCs, doing away with the academic performance indicator, system of evaluation, altering the provisions for appointment and making promotions arbitrary rather than time-bound and straightforward. Also, the provisions related to the consequence of violations of the draft regulations are drastic, excessive, and undemocratic. They require serious reconsideration. According to the draft regulations, non-academics who have served for at least 10 years at a senior level in industry, public administration, public policy, and or public sector undertakings with a proven track record of significant academic or scholarly contributions can be appointed as VCs. There is every possibility of the present political dispensation at the center using this provision as a camouflage behind which people of academic excellence will be substituted by people of political choice, as has happened in many of our iconic institutions, ranging from the Pune Film Institute to the ICHR. Such politically motivated interventions can seriously impinge upon the standards of higher education in the country. The draft regulations removes the API system of evaluation. In place, it introduces a new system which allows for a higher level of discretion. Along with that, the provisions for the appointment of assistant professors, especially about non-requirement of basic degree in the core subject concerned, will prove detrimental to the country's higher education sector. Previously, promotion was a time-bound, straightforward process. But under the draft regulations, teachers must meet new arbitrary criteria for promotion, including external fundraising and community service, which were not previously mandatory. The removal of the requirement for publications in care-listed journals for promotions actually introduces more arbitrariness. It needs to be noted that the introduction of the draft UGC regulations is not an isolated incident in terms of the union infringing upon the state's rights. Over the years, we have seen the union government repeatedly enacting laws that encroach upon the state's powers and duties in several sectors, even on law and order, which is absolutely in the state's reach in the Constitution. Laws have been made by the Union in agriculture, education, power, cooperation, and so on, crippling the state's rights. Even a ministry for cooperation has been formed at the center. Multinational agreements are being entered into on issues that affect the states without seeking the state's opinion, let alone getting their consent. The body blow to India's federal structure is coming from the union eating into the state's financial resources. It is now evident that the same people who preach cooperative federalism have tried to undercut the resources to be allocated to the states by the Finance Commission. On top of that, we are seeing the union's allocation for their own schemes coming down year after year, while the states are being forced to chip in more and more. According to RBI reports, the states are having to cover a substantial 65% of the country's total expenses, with the union's contribution being only 35%. But when it comes to revenue sharing, it goes in the reverse direction. And the revenue through which the union is meddling into states' affairs is through the governors appointed by them. Constitutionally, governors are to exercise their duties on the advice of the state cabinets. However, we have seen governors in opposition ruled states acting at the behest of the powers that appointed them, that is, the union government. We are all familiar with the case that was filed by the Delhi state government in the Honorable Supreme Court and the verdict of the Constitution bench. However, within days of that landmark judgment, in which the Honorable Chief Justice opined that, quote, a constitutionally entrenched and democratically elected government needs to have control over its administration, unquote. The union government introduced an ordinance and subsequently replaced it with a bill in the parliament. It proves to us that the union government will go forward with their authoritarian tendencies to any extent to usurp the rights of the states. We have seen gubernatorial excesses in Punjab, West Bengal, Odisha, Telangana, Tamil Nadu, and so on. In many states, including ours, we have seen governors trying to overreach their constitutional mandate by meddling with the autonomy of the legislature. I have already referred to how assent to bills passed by Legislative Assembly have been indefinitely delayed. In this context, as it is to be noted that the Supreme Court did warn the governors that they were playing with the fire, yet governors continued to play their political games at the behest of their masters. Multiple state governments have had to approach the judiciary against such undemocratic high-handedness. I had mentioned about our experiences with the offices of the governor and chancellor being held by the same person. In all opposition-ruled states, there have been instances to chancellors acting at the behest of their political masters in matters related to universities. Interests and statutes of the states have been sidelined in this regard. Rather than consulting the state governments, even on matters related to state-funded universities, governors have made political interference as chancellors. Such interferences will only be strengthened by the current draft regulations. There is also a large constitutional question at play with regard to the draft regulations. Can delegated legislation, that is, rules, regulations, notifications, etc., framed by the union government and its agencies under a union law, overrule the provisions of a plenary state law? It underlines a critical constitutional issue regarding the scope of delegated legislation and their potential for eroding the separation of powers and federalism, both of which are considered as basic features of the Indian Constitution. This question of law has its bearing on central-state relations as a whole. issues pertaining to which I had briefly mentioned earlier. State governments fund nearly 80% of the expenses for running universities and other higher education institutions. State governments play a crucial role in maintaining and enhancing the quality of universities. Last year, the government of Kerala spent rupees 1,824 crore for our universities under higher education department alone. There are other universities and institutions too. Altogether, we have spent more than rupees 3,000 crore rupees for higher education through various avenues. In the budget for the next financial year, we have committed to spend more than rupees 5,200 crore on higher education. Yet the approach of the Union Government and UGC is to exclude state governments from their administration, which is amply clear in the draft regulations. It cannot be the case that states will not have any real control over the universities established by laws enacted by state assemblies and run using states' financial and administrative resources. The fact that according to the draft regulations, significant appointments like that of vice chancellors can be made without any consultation with the state governments must be corrected. The approach of appointing vice chancellors from outside academia, even from the private sector, needs to be seen as an attempt to commercialize higher education. It is highly objectionable in that larger canvas. The regulations can only be viewed as part of an effort to undermine democratic values in higher education and to place this sector under the control of those promoting religious and communal ideologies. This cannot be allowed to pass. At a time when nations across the world are spending more and more on information and innovation so as to generate new knowledge, the Union government is spending money on establishing myths as facts and beliefs as science. We even have those at the helm of research institutions peddling falsehoods and superstitions as facts and as scientific truths. Yet the draft regulations do not seem to worry about these dangerous trends that are creeping into our higher education sector, which will undoubtedly send us backwards. Let us not go backwards. Let us move forward. Let us move forward by protecting the rights of states and preserving our systems, cultures, and languages. I hope that this national conclave will be a stepping stone in that regard and in making our country's higher education sector progressive and inclusive. With these words, I declare this National Convention on Draft UGC Regulation 2025 inaugurated. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now we have a guest of honor speaking to us. I invite the Honorable Deputy Chief Minister, Government of Telangana.